Today on the WhereTraveler podcast, our hostess, Teresa Rodriguez, talks with Tonya Pitts. She is in charge of the careful curation of your beverage pairings as the director of wine at the prestigious One Market restaurant in San Francisco. Tonya started her career in the food and beverage industry over 20 years ago as a host in St. Louis while she was in college studying fine arts. Her talents and her palate were quickly recognized by some nurturing food and wine professionals who saw that her desire and her work ethic matched up to her gifts, and they helped her develop. Tonya's studies eventually brought her to the Bay Area, where she landed a job in San Francisco as a server, first with Chef Judy Rogers at Zuni Cafe, and then with Chef Jeremiah Tower at Stars Restaurant. Those were two amazing restaurants in a culinary city, and she shined at both places. 3 years into San Francisco, and Tonya found herself running the wine program for Loretta Keller at Bizou. That's where she realized her passion for wine. Since then, Tonya has worked in several notable Bay Area establishments and has been featured in Wine and Spirits magazine, Tasting Panel, and a host of other industry publications. She is also a judge for the San Francisco International Wine Competition and is a tasting panelist for Wine and Spirits magazine. Now that all sounds impressive and highbrow, but being a sommelier is not just about choosing the finest wine to go with the finest dishes. It's about the wine in the dish bringing flavors, scents, and moods out of each other, and making those kinds of suggestions with sensitivity to the diner's tastes and their budget. Well, that's what Tonya seems to be so great at year after year. Now, if you like this kind of content and you want to support the WhereTraveler podcast, please go to iTunes or Spotify or iHeartRadio or whichever app you open to hear us and rate the show. And if you're feeling expressive, please write us a review and let other listeners know how you feel about it. Also, share the show with your friends and fellow travelers. It really helps us reach new listeners, and we sure do appreciate it. And now, along with our host, Teresa Rodriguez, here is our special guest today, Tonya Pitts.
You're listening to the WhereTraveler podcast, the audio companion for WhereTraveler magazine in print and online. For more information, go to wheretraveler.com. And now, Teresa Rodriguez, Editor-in-Chief for WhereTraveler San Francisco.
Hi, this is Teresa Rodriguez with the WhereTraveler podcast. Today, we go behind the scenes and past the wine cellar with Tonya Pitts, who was the sommelier at One Market Street restaurant in San Francisco. For the past 20 years, she's been sharing her knowledge of wine with the world. And today, it is our absolute pleasure to bring her on the podcast. Hey, Tonya, how you doing?
Hi, Teresa. How are you?
I'm great. I want to let our listeners know that I had an opportunity to spend some time with you last week, and you took us on a great journey around the world with some fantastic wines. So first, I'd love for you to share with us, how did you become a sommelier? How did that all work? Because I think that's one of the, beyond the becoming a travel writer, I think that's the second most wanted job in the world is drinking wine for a living.
It started for me quite by surprise. I was a student at university and started working in a restaurant to support myself, and stumbled upon a restaurant that was owned by a female chef who just come back from Provence. And this was in the Midwest, actually. And that's kind of how my restaurant experience and wine experience started. I couldn't even drink wine, much less anything else alcoholic. And we would have these really great meals at the end of the evening, what we call family meal. And they would break out wine, and wine was on the table. I couldn't drink, but I could swirl and smell and talk about what I was smelling in the glass. And one thing led to another, and there were other professionals there that realized that I had a nose and a palate and helped me to develop that. But I didn't start really drinking wine until I turned 21, and fast forward to moving to San Francisco because I decided I didn't want to pursue a law degree anymore, and I wanted to go to art school.
Oh,
And that's what brought me to San Francisco. And I couldn't go to school right away, so I got a job in a restaurant, and I started working at Zuni Cafe here with the late Judy Rogers. Sylvie Dar took me under her wing, who was then the wine director and sommelier. And from there, I met Loretta Keller, who worked for Jeremiah Tower at Stars. And I went to work for Loretta at her restaurant then, Bijou. But propelled by these other women to think outside of the box, because I'd never thought or known that being a sommelier was even anything that was remotely that I could do, or an option for me. I loved wine, and I loved talking about wine and pairing food and wine together for people that would come into the restaurant. But I had never thought of it as being something for me that could lead to where I am now. And that's been well over 20 years now. And for the longest time, I continued to be a sommelier and run programs in restaurants without any type of certification. And there are certifications that one can attain through Wine Spirits Trust or through the Court of Master Sommeliers, and there are endless other certifications now and organizations that offer a certification as a sommelier. It just happened to be the right time and the right day, and it fell into place for me to be able to take my first certification through the court. And that's when I knew that this was exactly what I was supposed to be doing.
I would love for you to explain the certification process, because I hear it's pretty intense. And can you just give us an example of one of the tests that you have to take to pass to become a professional somm?
So both Wine Spirits Trust and Court of Master Sommeliers are both organizations that are out of Europe and out of England. And they're both really very rigorous tests. Wine Spirits Trust is really geared towards masters of wine, which are much more technical and can tell you everything about grape growing, describe wines to you, blind and non-blind.
Yeah, let's explain that to people, because I don't think, I tried to do this once and I was blown away. So basically you're poured some wine in a glass and you're blind.
Basically, yes, you are.
And you have to tell your teacher or whoever it is, right, what it is,
yes.
Right? I mean, this is pretty intense stuff.
Within blind tasting, when you are being certified, there's 4 levels. The first level is introduction, and introduction through the Court of Master Sommeliers. You go through 3 days lecture and some blind tastings. And blind tastings basically is when someone that is administering a test or a seminar pours wine for you, and that could be a 2.5 ounce pour of a wine. It could be red or white wine. Usually there's some sort of theme to what you're tasting, whether that is, sometimes it'll be regional. They won't tell you the varietal and things like that. And when I say regional, that means it could come from the United States or the New World, or it could be Europe. But the thing is that when you're looking at that wine and smelling that wine, you have to identify what the grape varietal is, the region that's coming from, and the age of the wine.
What?
And well, first of all, that is blind tasting. And so, and that could be anything. And where it really gets tricky is when you have wines poured for you and you have no clue except that it's in a glass and it's red and it's white.
Crazy.
And that's when things really get tricky. And what happens is that from all the wines that you've ever tasted in your life that you have to your sensory memory, and then just the knowledge that you have of whether something is coming from a cool climate region or a warm region, because there's markers for those notes. If it's cool climate, you're usually going to get more stone fruit, less ripe fruits, more mineral, more acid, more earth and herbs. If it's a warmer region, you're going to get much more fruit character, concentration, sometimes more alcohol. There's all these markers that are there, but you basically have to look at the wine, smell the wine, taste the wine, and there are in your mind and also on a piece of paper. Once you are studying and learning, there is a piece of paper for you to look at and kind of check the boxes, if you would.
Wow.
And that's how we study and we learn and we practice, because we get to that point when we come to the end of things, of being able to blind taste. That's just one component of becoming a master sommelier. There's also, steps of service with opening a bottle of wine and being able to talk to a mock table about anything and everything that the masters decide to talk about with you in this scenario of being in a restaurant and being at a table and guiding someone through their meal.
So
it's really quite fascinating.
It is so fascinating. So can you give us like an example of one of the questions that they asked you that was just you're like, whoa.
So one of the questions that was asked in one of my tests, it was I was standing and opening a bottle of sparkling wine, and I was asked about dessert wine and dessert wines from all over the world, and what did I think, and at that point you're having to think on your feet. And it was difficult for me because I love dessert wine, but the majority of the dessert wines that I had been working with recently in the restaurant were all domestic. They were not, there was no Sauterne.
I'm Teresa Rodriguez, Editor-in-Chief of Where San Francisco, and you're listening to Where Travel Podcast, where we love to talk about anything related to travel. For more information about this episode, as well as WhereTraveler, be sure to check out WhereTraveler.com.
They were not, there was no Sauterne, there was no Banyuls, which are, all coming from France. Right. And so off the cuff, I had to talk about these wines and pretend that they were on the list.
Oh.
At my mock restaurant that she was having lunch in, and talk about it. And so things like that. And, it's great because when you do these things, you do get feedback. So it's not as if you're just working and going blind throughout all of this. And for me, what I took away from that is that I needed to work more on French wines, which, was funny to me because that's really how I learned and what I cut my teeth on, which were French wines. And so that just meant that I need to go back to books and study that region more and drink more and taste more of those wines. It's nerve-wracking. And, a lot of people have seen the movies Somm and Somm Into the Bottle, and that gives them kind of a snapshot and a view into things, but it's difficult and it's stressful and it's nerve-wracking. It really, really is.
Yeah, and I think that one of the fascinating things is that you're working with the olfactory gland, which is a memory-based gland. So if you never smelled lychee and don't know where that would be in a wine, you're like, what? So I just commend you on learning all of those scents and smells and textures and it's a lot of work.
When guests or just people are talking to me and they're like, well, we don't understand how you have all of these scents and smells and sights in your head. And I call it the Rolodex, and it's the Rolodex of all of these things that are, not in alphabetical order, but they're in some sort of category. And I just flip through quickly. But I always tell people, if they don't think that they have a sense of smell and taste and don't know what things smell like, pay attention when they go into the grocery store or to the farmer's market. Pick up an apple and smell an apple. Pick up an orange and smell an orange. If it's a vegetable or a fruit that they're not familiar with, pick it up and smell it. That's because everything has a scent.
Yeah.
And the more you do it, it basically becomes a memory for you. And that's one of the things that we're pulling from when we are tasting and eating and blind tasting wine.
That's so crazy. That's so fascinating. So let's talk about some of your favorites right now. You know way more than I do about wine. So share with our listeners about some of the places and wines that you're excited about.
Well, for me, I always like to share whenever I've found something new or different or exciting, or even something that has been popular before but has fallen out of fashion. I think people need to start thinking about it again. And one of those things right now for me is wines from Australia. I just wrapped up a 4-day seminar in South Lake Tahoe that was put on by Wines of Australia. And this is the second year that they've done this, and it's called Wines of Australia Decanted. And it's more like a TED Talk, if you would, over 4 days of immersing people, wine professionals, wine writers, sommeliers, masters of wine, into thinking about and talking about wines from Australia. And what we've known to be these Shirazes from the Barossa in Australia are still these really full-bodied, powerful wines. But there's also this other school of thought of, why not take these wines and use some new oak and some used oak, but not have the vines hang out for as long and have the bricks, the sugars get quite as high, and see what happens if we take these wines and make them much more approachable now, but also able to age. And I'm using Shiraz and Cabernet Sauvignon as an example of that. But we're finding that the same things are happening with other varietals that are being grown in Australia. So Chardonnay, which we usually see as being a much more lusher grape varietal, sometimes having a lot more oak and what we call that creamy, buttery, unctuous. Chardonnay is actually drinking more lean, more clean, more bright, with really succulent fruit, but with not as much of the oak coming through, if oak at all. It's kind of going back to the roots of winemaking, which is being much more terroir driven. Terroir meaning more about the sense of place and more about where the site is and where the grapes are coming from. It was really, really fascinating. The first night that we were there, Jane Ferrari, who is, for all accounts and purposes, kind of the storyteller for Yalumba Wines in South Australia. And she basically gave us a history lesson, just how the colony got started in Australia. And it was just really fascinating to trace everything.
Yeah,
back. And it made me realize how much of a history buff I am. And I think that's really one of the reasons why I became a sommelier as well, because there's so much history tied into that glass and into that bottle of wine that you're tasting or you're drinking.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I totally agree with you. The Barossa Valley was founded by Germans who came and settled there and brought their techniques. And I love the story of terroir, which was, the word actually popped up, I believe, in Burgundy and around Vougeot with the monks who actually went through and categorized the soil. And that's so powerful. And I love what you said about terroir, which was a sense of place. And what other places do you really feel that are making wine that really capture that sense of place, that they're not just manufacturing wine for the manufacture of wine, but that when you open that bottle, you go, wow, I am in blank?
Portugal.
Oh,
which Portugal has kind of been on the radar, off the radar for a couple of years now. And I think when people think of Portuguese wine, they think of wine that is fresh, inviting, but also not very expensive and budget friendly. And yes, there are those wines that are there as well that are super quaffable, that, don't break the bank. But then we have, other wines that are coming out of Portugal that are also really very well made and have decided to go back to the way that their ancestors made wine, the ancient way of making wine, which is, sometimes with no electricity. There are those, experiments that are out there, but not using any sulfur at all. And also much more natural wines, organic, and then also biodynamic wines, which the biodynamic wines are going to follow the process of the Farmer's Almanac, which is basically looking at the harvest and full moon and the cycle of life, if you would, within the soil and within the earth and within a farm. And so that would mean bringing in elements into the vineyard that will fly in, live there, and take out the elements that you do not want. And that's the way that I like to explain biodynamics to people, because sometimes they call it, it's this mystical kind of voodoo wine, if you would. You take a cow's horn and you take a tea tincture and manure, and then you take it and you bury it and you do this whole ritual, which there is some of that's there. Yes, there is. Yes, that is the way that you do fertilize, but you can also create tinctures and teas to use as sprays also on the vines and on the leaves to help with disease and things like that.
Yeah, and so I'm just going to let our listeners know, if you don't know what biodynamic farming is, it's the philosophy that a piece of land in itself is a living organ, and every component of that land plays a important role in the health of that. So goats play an important part, insects play an important part, and like you said, with the moon cycles play an important part. If it's a full moon, you trim. If it's a waiting moon, wanting or waiting or whatever it is. Obviously, I don't know much about the moon cycle, people, but so it's all on. Like, this is why I'm not a biodynamic farmer.
No.
But what's so fascinating to me is, I think, like what you said about the cow horn, is one of the reasons they do that now is because there's no cows roaming the land. So they're putting the cow horn, which is that protein, and the manure, which would be part of the cycle of life, right? Putting that back in the ground.
Absolutely.
The ground has that.
If you had those animals there on your property naturally to begin with, which is how people lived, back in the Middle Ages and beyond.
Right. So it's and I love it. And I love the fact that there are so many wineries that are really taking up that charge to go back to that place of biodynamic farming. It's fascinating. And I'd love for you to explain to our listeners too about Portugal, because it was only a few years ago that I actually learned that port is from Portugal. So could you share with our listeners about port and Portugal and that connection?
Absolutely. And I think what we know and what's more prevalent to us that we see is port wine, which is a fortified wine. Fortified meaning that the wine is made and there's the alcohol that's there is actually added alcohol. So you're going to add a clear spirit, brandy spirit, to the wine, as well as having grown the grapes. The grapes are going to have to get to a certain brix amount, brix, which are actually sugars. So you will make port as you would a regular wine by stemming it, pressing it, foot treading it. Yes, foot treading is something.
Foot treading. It's not just in balls.
We don't want that kind of foot treading. And then you basically ferment, and the alcohol eats up the sugars, and you actually add distilled alcohol to it, which stops also the sugars and the alcohol. And
port came from Portugal.
Port came from Portugal. And what a lot of people don't realize is that there are several different grapes that go into port. What we know is Trigo Nacional as being one of those grapes, but there's also Tempranillo. There's also some Malbec that can go in as well. It really depends upon the maker, but there are usually three main grapes that go into port. But there's, if my memory serves me correct, there's over 900 different varietals that are grown in Portugal.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
And there's probably, I think, maybe 5 major port houses as well. But, the port industry was really fueled by the English, because the English drank lots of port wine.
Well, they could travel with it too, right? Because it didn't.
They could. And, everything was delivered by boat, because that was our means of transportation.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And I just want to share with our listeners that Tonya was a fantastic host at her restaurant at 1 Market Street, where Chef Mark has come up with an incredible a menu for fall, which is, this farm to table menu that's really bringing out the rich flavors of autumn right now. And I would love for you to talk about the wine from upstate New York that we drank, because I love number one, I love the history of that wine, but 2, I loved that wine. So could you share that with our listeners?
So the wine that Teresa's speaking of is Dr. Constantine Frank. And Dr. Constantine Frank basically came to the Finger Lakes from the Ukraine in the 1940s, and was told that he could not grow any vinifera vines in upstate New York because, east of the Mississippi, they wouldn't grow. You wouldn't be able to harvest anything other than grapes for ice wine, for dessert wine. And he proved them wrong. And he brought over clippings from the Ukraine as well as from Germany and planted them. And so I paired the Gruner Veltliner, which is a white wine grape that is usually grown in Austria, with grilled octopus and butterbean puree and ancho chilies and niçoise olives. And it was absolutely delicious with the dish. And Gruner Veltliner is usually a much more high acid white wine. The soil content is made up of blue limestone and slate and clay and chalk, and it's really very difficult for grapes to grow because they don't get a lot of sunlight. The sunlight actually is mirrored from the lake and the river that is surrounding all the vines, and so that helps with photosynthesis. But it's an absolutely amazing grape, and the fact that he brought that over and planted it in upstate New York, and we're able to enjoy it here in California just absolutely thrills me. I had a Riesling from the family in the early 90s when they brought some to California and put it on immediately by the glass very early in my career. And when someone brought it in again recently, I was super excited because I had wondered where the wine was and why I hadn't seen any on the West Coast. But, you know, those East Coasters, they keep all that Finger Lake wine for themselves, so they don't like to share.
But that was really, I would have to say, Tonya, that really was a sense of place. I really felt when I was drinking that wine that I could feel how hard, you know, I could feel that little cutting coming across the ocean so many decades ago and getting planted in a place that really is not supposed to have grapes growing.
Yeah.
And I love what you said about the water around it so that it was able to, you know, reflect the light to give it that photosynthesis to you know, keep it growing. I mean, that's what's so fascinating to me about wine. It's living. This is actual living, a living entity that somebody puts so much work into taking care of and growing and to harvest and ferment and bottle. And,
that end result of having it in the bottle, it still leaves it. It's still living and breathing.
It's amazing.
You know, until we ingest it, it's still living and breathing.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, you know, I think it's sometimes still living and breathing.
Well, yeah, I've had those days too, where I've experienced so much of so many different places on my palate in one day, and it's like, oh, okay, we're done now.
I'm gonna
what we call palate fatigue.
yeah, that's what I'm gonna call it from now on, palate fatigue. But
palate fatigue.
Yeah, I want to also talk about your passion for also elevating women in wine and minorities in wine, not only sommeliers but also the winemakers. Can you really talk about that passion and what you're doing to support that desire that you have?
So I have my passion project, I like to call it. For the last 2 years, in June and July, my focus is on women in wine, women winemakers, winery owners, executives within a organization, a winery, that produce wine or make that entity go. I offer these wines as half off the whole month of July, but we always have a cocktail party, and that cocktail party, I have the female winemakers there, or gallery or winery owners there, and people can come in and taste the wine and have conversations with these women. From time to time, sometimes they're there throughout the month, and you can also talk to them as well during dinner or lunch service if they're there. And that's my way of giving back. You know, even if it's a winery that no one's ever really heard of, or tries the wine, if it makes sense and it's delicious and it's well made, then it works and it's on the list. Also in February, I have a program for Black History Month, for African American History Month. And we've done that. I've done that program for a couple of years now. And again, I invite winemakers in. Chef Mark creates a menu, and usually that's in concert with another chef. And for the last 3 years, we've done that with Chef David Lawrence, formerly of 1300, who owns Black Bar Barbecue. And that's been really exciting. But the most exciting with that project has been this last year, where the chefs put together a menu, and it was a tasting menu that you could come in and have for lunch or dinner. And I paired wines with that menu, and the wines were much more, I don't want to use the word elevated, but the wines were much more complex than what we would normally see offered. And because I wanted to showcase winemakers that do make collectible wines, wines that you could buy and have in your cellar and age, which is not what people are usually shown by African American winemakers. Usually it's wines that you can kind of open, pop, and pour. But then again, when people buy wine, they say people buy a bottle of wine and they have it in their possession for what, 24 to 48 hours.
Right.
But there are those that do collect wines. And the wines that I showcased this past year were collectible. Dara Jean Jones, who produces wines out of Napa Valley. She has a Cabernet Sauvignon, Cap Franc, and Merlot, which are all coming from Stagecoach, and of that caliber of the wines that we find that come from that area. You know, the Paul Hobbs, to name a few, Rainey, all of those that come from that area. So they're more in that price point of finding, you know, $75 to $100 on her website or in a wine store. Also, Theodora Lee, who is a lawyer and owns land up in Mendocino. I met Theodora several years ago, and she came in and had a special event for, you know, a law firm, and said, "Hey, can I speak with you? I make wine, and I'd love if you would try it sometimes." And she told me her story, and I said, "I would love to try it sometime." She said, "Well, actually, I have a bottle. Do you want to try?" I was like, "Absolutely." and this is a true story. So she works with a grape varietal called Symphony, which is a hybrid of Grenache Gris and Muscat of Alexandria. And it's a light floral wine that has stone fruit, tropical fruits, but that's bone dry. The residual sugar in the middle of the palate is not very high at all, but it drinks a little bit like Riesling and Gewürztraminer and just knock out. So Chef's there, Chef Mark. I said, "Here, try this," you know, and he's like, "Wow, this is really delicious." 2 weeks later, comes back with a dish. I buy the wine, we put it on, we run it by the glass for probably about a year. And from that, we have these articles that are written about the wine and the story being told about what happened. We were the first restaurant to buy her wine.
Wow.
You
And
know?
she's a lawyer, which is a great
She's
story.
a lawyer. Yeah, and she's a lawyer. Yeah.
And that just,
Her winemaker is Ed Kurtz, and Ed has, you know, made fantastic wine for Roar Wines over the years, Fort Ross, and his own wine, Sandlands and August West. And that's who's working with her and making her wines now. And of course, she has her hands in it as well, because, it's a project that you make together.
Yeah.
But it's, and it's fascinating how someone can have a love for wine and kind of fall into things.
Yeah.
And it's a passion. And then all of a sudden, you take a chance and start experimenting and making wine in your garage or, at a crush facility. Someone takes a chance on you, and then there you are, and you've got a product and you're making wine.
Yeah.
So,
and then we've got Tonya, pairing it. What are some of the questions that our listeners should ask when talking to a sommelier about their wine choices at dinners?
Well, what I like to say is it's not always the guest or the customer that needs to ask the questions. It's our job as the sommelier to ask the questions, to suss out what a guest really wants. It needs to be as easy and as comfortable and as pleasurable and enjoyable as possible for the guest, because, we're the servant of the wine. We're the steward of the wine. And we're there to make sure that everything goes well for our guests. I like to think of it very much as they've come to my home for a meal, and I'm their host. And it's my job to make sure that they enjoy themselves above anything and everything. So I'm able to talk to them about wine, talk to them about the dish, talk to them about a cocktail, and be able to discern what it is that they would like. And so when someone comes in and they say, oh, we'd love to have a great bottle of Chardonnay. How do you like your Chardonnay? Is there a particular region that you like it from? Do you want a Chardonnay that is drier or one that has more fruit? And we start from there.
Oh, got it. I see.
In just a couple of words, I know where to send this guest and what to suggest for them.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, Tonya, I wanted to thank you so much for your time. I have to say that one of my favorite pairings of all time was that octopus with that wine from New York. And I think that any of our listeners who want to head over to One Market restaurant, which is located at One Market Street in San Francisco. Don't let the name confuse you, because it shouldn't.
That's right.
And Tonya, you're there at nights, during the days. When can our listeners?
Oh, I'm always there. I am a fixture. I'm usually there Tuesday through Saturday for both lunch and dinner. If you happen to pop in and you don't see me for lunch, just ask for me. Chances are I am in the cellar.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you, my dear, for your time. And I look forward to seeing you back at One Market.
Thank you so much for having me on the show today. It's always my pleasure. And I love talking to you. I could talk to you about wine all day long.
All night, 4 hours in, we can.
That's right.
Just FYI, that's how long our last dinner together was we sat down at 6 p.m. and I was not out of the restaurant until 10 p.m. at night. And it was a beautiful, fascinating tour of the food that the chef was coming up with this, with the change of the seasons and the incredible wines that Tonya was bringing. I really just think that's, if somebody says, Teresa, what is your favorite thing to do? That would be it. That would be like, give me 4 hours and let me sit with Tonya and Mark Chef and eat my way through your knowledge, his expertise, your expertise. It's just fantastic. So highly recommend it. For anybody who's coming to San Francisco, talk to your concierge. They can make you dinner reservations at One Market. Make sure to ask for Tonya Pitts, and you will not be let down by Chef Mark, who I really want to get on the show. He's so busy right now, but we're going to make it happen with him. This is your host, Teresa Rodriguez, with WhereTraveler magazine. You can hear this podcast at WhereTraveler.com, as well as your iPhone and Spotify and many, many other places. My guest today was Tonya Pitts, sommelier at One Market Restaurant in San Francisco, California.
Thank you, listeners, for joining me. You've been listening to the WhereTraveler podcast, hosted by me, Teresa Rodriguez. This episode was produced and directed by Pete A. Turner, John Leon Guerrero, and Victoria Shepard. To listen to this podcast, find out more information about the crew, as well as WhereTraveler, visit wheretraveler.com, your ultimate destination guide.